Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am Danielle, aka Stitcherista here on YouTube, and today is going to be another face-to-face chat and a true crime story time. Today's story is called The Longest Night. And I have Snowball here with me. Tootsie Pop was such a big hit, but he needed a break from the true crime, so Snowball is going to hear today's story. But I do have some unfortunate news. Yesterday when Bill got home, he received a call from his brother-in-law, and Bill's sister has taken a turn for the worse. Remember, she was in the hospital with COVID, and she was getting better, but she took a turn for the worse. So Bill decided to fly out to Nashville today, and I've been up since 3:30 a.m. I took him to the airport. And yeah, so they didn't expect her to live for 24 hours. So he wanted to go out there to see if he could at least see her and see what was really going on. And it's just so awful. The whole thing is just so awful. And there was really no point, I guess, in me going right now. I told him, if she does pass and there's a funeral, I'll fly out separately because my stepdaughter wanted to go. It's never good timing when something like this happens, but this weekend her boyfriend's parents are having a renewal ceremony and she's in it, and we're supposed to go. It's in Ocean City, and Bill is his flight back is Friday, but I guess that's kind of up in the air, depending on what's going to happen. So yeah, that's what's going on with that. So, in the middle of the arbitration, towards the end of it, I'm trying to find him a flight, book him a hotel, get him a rental car. That wasn't cheap, all of that. But what the money doesn't matter, right? But yeah. So, any kind of prayers and good thoughts, much appreciated. Okay. Yesterday, I had the arbitration. It went fine. Yesterday was better than Tuesday. Well, what's today? Today's Wednesday. Yesterday was better than Monday. Let's put it that way. And, yeah. I've already had 2 cups of coffee, so I need to be drinking some water right now. Yeah, I figured I wouldn't be able to go back to sleep. I was back home by right before 5 a.m. And I just got a cappuccino, laid in bed, read my book, which the book is so good, The Neighbor's Secret. But I figure I'm going to be really glad when the arbitration is over today, so I can... And I see myself getting to bed early tonight. I'm glad though that if she does pass and there winds up being a funeral, which I don't know how that's going to transpire, if there will be one or what's going to happen. At least I'm off all next week. My boss has confirmed that she's not taking any work next week, so if need be, I can fly out there this weekend if I have to. So, or Monday or whatever. So we'll see. With stuff like this, anything is possible. I remember my grandfather didn't have COVID, but he was in his 90s, and there were a few times where they thought he was going to die and he didn't. So, I don't know. But okay. I did stitch some last night. Stayed up too late. Yeah. I stitched until we had dinner late because of all of that going on. And then I did do some stitching though, which I'll show on my vlog. But okay. So today's story is The Longest Night. Peter Aston was 13 years old and he was already 6 feet. Wow. It's going to be a tall boy. 13 and you're already 6 feet tall. That should have made him immune from bullying at Kingston State School, but Peter was bony and awkward, and he also wore thick glasses. As a result, he was picked on, mocked, and taunted by the other kids. Only one of his classmates treated him with any kindness, and that was Terry Ryan. Shortly after Peter enrolled at the school in Brisbane, Australia, he and Terry started hanging out together, and that hanging out seldom took place on school property. The boys were fond of playing hooky. Okay. So it was on the morning of May 4th, 1982. So they played hooky on the morning of May 4th, 1982. The previous day, Peter had told Terry that he planned to run away from home and hitchhike to Melbourne, where his older brother lived. Terry agreed to accompany him as far as the Gold Coast, but before Peter hit the road, they decided to visit their favorite fishing hole. Then they took a train into the Brisbane city center and browsed the shops, buying several items of clothing and a pack of cigarettes. Finally, in the early afternoon, they took a train to Beenleigh and made their way to the Gold Coast Highway. Hitching a ride would prove tough that day, with one car after another zooming by without stopping. The boys were on the verge of giving up when they spotted a yellow Daihatsu, never even heard that, Daihatsu SUV parked on the hard shoulder up ahead. The hood was up, and there was a man tinkering with the engine, and another man sat in the passenger seat, and the boys decided to ask them for a ride. I'm guessing this is where the story's really going to start, right? The man who had been working under the hood was happy to oblige them. He told them that his name was Bob and that his friend was called Paul. Peter was encouraged to get in the front passenger seat, displacing Paul, who got into the back with Terry. Moments later, they were zipping down the highway heading south. But they had covered only a short distance when things began to go very wrong for the teenagers. First, Paul reached down and retrieved a rifle which had been hidden under a blanket on the floor. This he held to Terry's head. Then Bob pulled the vehicle to the side of the road. Then the men produced handcuffs and cuffed the two boys. They said they were police officers and were arresting them for hitchhiking. What? Peter tried to protest but received a slap in the face for his trouble. This was just the first inkling of what was to come. As they resumed their journey, both boys were slapped and punched, although it was Peter who received the worst of the treatment. I have such a hard time with stuff like this because it just doesn't make sense. I just don't understand how people can conduct themselves in this way just in their everyday life. I've never even slapped someone. I have a hard time wrapping my brain around that. This abuse would continue once the foursome reached their destination, a desolate bush track near Kingscliff over the state border in New South Wales. Here the boys were forcibly dragged from the car. Both were forced to lay face down in the dirt with their legs spread. While in this position, thumb cuffs were fitted to them. What the hell are thumb cuffs? And Peter's clothes were ripped off. His efforts to resist only brought a barrage of slaps, punches, and kicks. Wow. By now, the sky had turned dark, but there was a full moon that night, amply illuminating the scene. Bob and Paul's malicious attention was now focused solely on Peter, who they had for some reason chosen for maltreatment over his friend. Peter was kicked and stomped. He was struck repeatedly with the rifle butt. The blows delivered with such force that the wood eventually splintered. I don't know how he didn't die from that, right? Then they began stabbing the teenager. Deep wounds intended not to kill, but to inflict pain. When Peter started screaming, they stuffed pieces of his torn shirt into his mouth, and still the torture continued. Fetching a leather punch from the car, Paul used it to punch holes in the boy's earlobes. What? Wow. I don't even know what to say to this. Right, Snowball? Yeah. Now a petrified Terry was dragged to his feet, hauled over. Oh my good night. I kind of glance ahead when I'm reading. hauled over to where his badly maimed friend lay and forced to perform fellatio on him. Jesus Christ. Then Paul shaved off some of Peter's pubic hair and forced Terry to eat it. What? God, these poor boys. What the? Wow. It is impossible to imagine the pain and terror of these two innocent boys, but a long, terrifying night was only getting started. And I'm thinking, did Bob and Paul just park on the side of the road? Like, was that their game to, like, lure people? People do that. Okay, so soon Bob and Paul were working on Peter again, stabbing and cutting. Twice, Peter managed to stumble to his feet. He tried to flee, but was run to ground and dragged back by his abusers. I guess your instinct would be to try to get away. Then Bob fetched a shovel from the car and started hitting Peter with it, using the sharp end to open deep gashes on his scalp. Gee, that poor boy endured. I don't know how he's still alive. At one point, he handed the tool to Terry and ordered him to strike his friend with it. Left with no other option, the boy complied. I mean, I guess they would have killed him if he wouldn't have done it, right? So Peter Astor had by now suffered terrible injuries which would undoubtedly have resulted in his death. Immediate medical care might still have saved him, but no such care was forthcoming. The boy was lying on the ground with his blood pooled around him, faint, animalistic whimpers issuing from his throat. Bob and Paul were also spattered with blood from the horrendous injuries they had inflicted, but they had grown tired of their deadly game now. And it was time to end this. So after inflicting one final indignity, shaving off Peter's hair with the sharp end of a hunting knife, Bob ended the child's life by driving the blade into his skull. Then he removed Terry's handcuffs, handed him the shovel, and ordered him to dig a hole. Imagine the thoughts that must have been going through Terry Ryan's mind at this time. Yeah, he's probably thinking, well, they're going to make me bury my friend, and then they're going to kill me, right? He had just seen his best friend brutally murdered. He could identify the men who had done it. Surely they could not allow him to leave this place alive. Surely he too would die once the hole was dug. Desperate, Terry tried a ploy. He asked Bob if he could join them. Okay. How do we know that we can trust you, was Bob's response. And Terry replied, you saw me hit him with the shovel, didn't you? Like, I'm complicit in this too, is what he's trying to say. And to this, Bob simply grunted. The hole was now deep enough, and the men dragged Peter's body over and crammed it in, nearly folding it double to do so. Oh my God. Then they covered the corpse with dirt and piled some tree branches on top of the makeshift grave. Finally, they threw their stuff into the back of the SUV and ordered Terry to get in. Then followed a rambling drive during which they stopped at a public restroom to wash up and at a dumpster to dispose of Peter's clothes. During that ride, Bob told Terry that he and Paul were devil worshippers and that Peter had been killed as a sacrifice to Satan. Okay. Bob says, you won't say anything about this to anyone, will you? And Terry swore that he would keep his mouth shut. Of course you would say that. Good, Bob said, because you know what will happen to you if you do. And it was at that moment that Terry knew he was going to survive this terrible night. Amazingly, the killers of his best friend dropped him right outside his house. Wow! I mean, that is pretty amazing. They left him with another stern warning to keep his mouth shut. Terry promised that he would and then went inside and immediately blurted out the story to his mother. Half believing that her son was on drugs, Belita Ryan drove him to the nearby Bentley police station where he repeated his story. By the pre-dawn hours, he was leading a team of police officers back to the crime scene. After a couple of false starts, he eventually found the place and Peter Astor was disinterred from his recently dug grave. He had been so horribly mutilated that the pathologist would later comment, every part of his body was defiled. And yet, none of these injuries had killed Peter. He had still been alive when they had put him in the ground. He had asphyxiated. Good fucking night. Oh my God. The boy would have lived. By the following day, a massive manhunt was underway for the suspects known only as Bob and Paul. Officers were asked to be on the lookout for a yellow Daihatsu. They were also warned not to approach but to call for backup. Then the police called a break. An Army private named Robert Ponzetti, based at a Nagara Army camp, reported that his car, a 1978 Holden Sunbird, had been stolen. The perpetrators were two fellow soldiers who had taken the vehicle from him at gunpoint. They were 34-year-old Corporal Robin Reed and 17-year-old Private Paul Luckman. Even more important was what Ponzetti told the police next. He said that Luckman had told him why they needed the vehicle. They needed to make a getaway. And he had said to them, "We're the ones who killed that boy." The story had been on the news all day, so wow. So now the police had an identification on Bob and Paul and a description of the car they were driving. A bulletin went out immediately with the same protocol in place: do not approach, call for backup. Just before 12 p.m. that day, Constable Vincent Towns spotted a blue Holden Sunbird near Tenterfield, New South Wales, driving at a sedate pace. Aware that just such a vehicle was the subject of an ongoing manhunt, Towns followed, keeping a discreet distance until the Holden pulled over at a rest stop some 20 miles further on. Then Towns also stopped and kept the car under surveillance. He saw two men getting out of the Holden, men who matched the description of the suspects. Then the men spotted him, hurried back to their car, and sped off. Unfortunately for them, Constable Towns had already radioed ahead, smart man, and they drove straight into a roadblock. Reed got out of the vehicle with his hands up. Luckman was found cowering in the back seat. With an eyewitness to the murder and with incriminating evidence retrieved from their barrack room and from their Daihatsu, Reed and Luckman had little option but to admit to their involvement in Peter Astor's death. However, each tried to minimize his own role, blaming the other and even trying to lay the blame on Terry Ryan. Yeah, good luck with that. When the matter came to trial, Paul Luckman entered a not guilty plea, contending that he had only participated in the murder under threat of death from his co-accused. Robin Reed, meanwhile, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You know, to inflict something like that on someone, you would have to be not in your right mind. I mean, yeah. One of the more interesting aspects to come out of the trial was the background information offered on the killers, the circumstances that had brought them to this atrocious act. Robin Reed was a migrant from the UK who had arrived in Australia as a teenager and had worked a number of dead-end jobs before joining the army. His military career had hardly been stellar. It had taken him 10 years to reach the rank of corporal. However, Reed enjoyed his life at the Inagara barracks, where he was responsible for handing out assignments to recent recruits. As a bisexual man, this gave him the perfect opportunity to hit on naive and inexperienced teenagers. One of those teens was Paul Luckman, a boy from a deprived background who had endured physical and sexual abuse during his childhood and had ended up working as a male prostitute on the streets of Melbourne. Luckman had enlisted in the army to sort his life out and had fallen almost immediately under the influence of Robin Reed. Reed was attracted to the effeminate Luckman and invited him to move into his quarters, so that's highly inappropriate. He had soon indoctrinated the 17-year-old into his worldview, which included an interest in Satanism, witchcraft, and sexual torture. It wasn't long before the men were talking about abducting and torturing a young man. Just days before they killed Peter Aston, they had picked up another young hitchhiker and subjected him to a vicious beating. That boy had lived, Peter Astor had not. Both Reed and Luckman were ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Reed, that meant a life of isolation as he was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. Several prisoners had threatened to do him in. Even among criminals, child killers are reviled. Yes, absolutely. As for Paul Luckman, he was able to trade on his girlish looks, exchanging sexual favors for protection and contraband. He was back in the news in 1990 when an outraged public learned that he would undergo a sex change operation at taxpayers' expense. He later changed his name by deed poll to Nicole Louise Pierce and was released under that name in October of 1999. Wow. Okay, so he could technically start his or her life over. Wow, that was an awful story, though. That poor boy. And the poor kid that lived, I mean, to have to witness that and then be forced to partake in it, he had to have therapy. I mean, you would not be able to go on without something, right? I mean, you wouldn't. There's no way. That was a rough one, wasn't it, Snowball? Yeah. So again, thank you for all the well wishes that I know I'll probably receive in the comments for Bill and his sister and his family. I mean, it's life. It's a shame. I mean, his sister is only in her early 50s, so yeah. But okay, I hope you guys are having a great Wednesday. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you so much for watching and subscribing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye, guys.